to Mekelle Foresight. Today we have a guest, Ambassador David Shin. He has worked as ambassador to Ethiopia a long time ago, but he served in so many capacities in various countries around the world and in his country, the US. We will focus more today on the Pretoria Agreement and the Nairobi implementation metrics. I'm sure you have been following up the process in Ethiopia and the agreement that has been reached over a month ago. Dear Ambassador, tell us your impression of that agreement. How did you take that?
Sure, happy to give my response to that. One, I think it's certainly a step in the right direction in that it, at a minimum, seems to have ended the actual fighting between the forces of the central government of Ethiopia and those of Tigray. It's less clear what is going on with the Eritrean troops in Tigray and the Amhara militia. They seem to still be active in the region. I'm a long ways away from what's happening on the ground, so I don't know with certainty the degree to which the Eritreans and the militias are engaging in combat. But at a minimum, the level of fighting is significantly reduced, and that's a good thing because that means fewer people are being killed. The humanitarian relief deliveries have obviously begun. They're still not reaching all areas of Tigray, according to my understanding, but they are reaching some areas, particularly those areas where you have Ethiopian National Defense Force troops, and perhaps they're reaching other parts of Tigray also. That too is a good thing. A few services, I understand, have resumed in parts of Tigray. There has been an order that banking be resumed, although that does not seem to have happened yet. And some telecommunications apparently are underway in a few limited parts of Tigray, although internet, I gather, is still not functioning on any kind of a normal basis there. The point being that some elements of the peace agreement seem to be working, and to the extent that it's possible to implement all elements of the peace agreement, I think all sides will eventually be better off for it, and certainly the pain and the hardship will be significantly reduced. So I'm cautiously optimistic that this will be a positive, that the peace agreement is a positive development.
Yes, indeed, many are cautiously optimistic. So with Eritrean forces still being in Tigray, as some of the media reporters show, and the Amhara forces, do you think the agreement, the ceasefire will hold, given the presence of Eritrean forces in Tigray?
Well, clearly, the Tigrayan forces, according to the peace agreement, agreed to disarm within 30 days. But they have subsequently made very clear that that is contingent upon the Eritrean forces leaving Tigray and the ENDF replacing the Amhara militia in Western Tigray. So until that happens, I don't see disarmament being completed, and I understand that. I have no idea what the Eritrean forces have in mind, whether their intention is to leave or whether it's to stay. I simply don't know. But that is probably the most significant short-term factor that could interrupt the peace process if the Eritrean forces remain inside Tigray. If they were to leave and go back to Eritrea, then I would be much more comfortable in predicting a good outcome for the peace agreement.
The U.S. has been, very closely supporting this peace process. What can the U.S. do to make sure that the forces, the actors in the conflict, uh, abide by the agreement, including, you know, although they have not signed, the Eritrean forces?
Well, because the ENDF and the Tigrayan forces seem to be complying with the agreement, so far that is not an issue. The problem at the moment is with the Eritrean forces. And unfortunately, the United States has very little leverage in Eritrea. And for that matter, I'm not sure who does have leverage in Eritrea today. We have no ambassador there. We have a charge d'affaires, a very small embassy. We have almost no trade, virtually no foreign direct investment, no aid program. There just is no strong American leverage over Eritrea. And I know the United States has talked to other parties who have somewhat greater leverage there, and they have apparently not shown much interest in terms of using that leverage to encourage the Eritreans to leave Tigray. So this is a real dilemma, and I don't have a good answer for it.
Yeah. So, do you see a future? I mean, a bright future for Ethiopia? Uh, there's still the Tigray conflict is not the only conflict in Ethiopia now. There's the problem in Oromia and in other parts of the country.
I would be dishonest if I said I saw a bright future in the immediate months and even year or two ahead. I have been following events in Ethiopia going back to the early 1960s, and historically, I've followed Ethiopian developments for even longer than that. But I served as the assistant desk officer for Ethiopia in the State Department in 1969 to 71, for example, during the Haile Selassie government. And I have tried to keep track of what has happened in Ethiopia ever since. I don't think I have ever been more discouraged about what is going on throughout the country than I have been over the last couple of years. It has been exceedingly disappointing to me to see a country with so much potential, so many people, talented people in it, running into the problems that they are having, as you say, not just in Tigray, but they extend far beyond Tigray. And the government absolutely has to get a handle on these problems. Uh, Initially, the problems were primarily one of ethnic conflict. That's hard enough to deal with, but now there are serious economic problems in the country. So it's absolutely essential that the conflict be brought to an end and then work begin on restoring Ethiopia's what was a rather strong economy. So I'm at the moment, I'm still a little pessimistic about the situation, but I think the peace agreement for dealing with Tigray is a very encouraging step and maybe the first step towards bringing Ethiopia back to where it should be.
The cessation of hostilities agreement signed in Pretoria, although the name says cessation of hostilities agreement, it seems to go beyond that. It encompasses political, accountability issues, which uh, which is good, but not explicitly providing the mechanism for effecting those provisions.
Well, you're correct. It does go beyond just a cessation of hostilities, or what some call a ceasefire. I'm not sure there's much distinction between a ceasefire and a cessation of hostilities, and it does not spell out in detail how to grapple with some of the problems that it identifies that need to be resolved. For example, there's really very little said about accountability for war crimes, that have taken place in various parts of Ethiopia, not just in Tigray. And at some point, there has to be accountability. Normally, though, accountability for past crimes is always something that comes later. The immediate problem is stopping the fighting, stopping the killing, and getting all parts of the country functioning again. And I understand that, and I think that is what the peace agreement is trying to do. The details can be worked out. I think some of them were worked out at the Nairobi sessions. There was more detail there than we saw coming out of Pretoria. So I'm not too discouraged about that. I've seen these peace agreements in other African countries. Some of them have succeeded, some have not. They're very complex, they're exceedingly difficult to implement. This one is probably more difficult to implement than many. It's more complex, and it doesn't deal with all of the conflicts in the country. At some point, the government has to decide how it's going to stop those issues also. But the immediate one is getting the situation in Tigray resolved to the satisfaction of both sides.
From your experience as a senior American official, over the many years of your career, what do you think the U.S. can play, going forward in implementing, in helping to implement this agreement?
Well, the one thing it's already done, and I think will continue to do, is to provide the bulk of the humanitarian assistance to all of those parts of Ethiopia that are in need of it. Some are in need of it due to drought. In the Somali region, it's an issue of drought, not an issue of ethnic conflict. In Tigray, it's due to the conflict over the last 2 years. In parts of Oromia, there are other reasons for why humanitarian assistance are needed, or also in Amhara region. So the U.S. will, I think, continue to do that. It has been the major provider of humanitarian assistance to Ethiopia for many decades now. This is something that's often overlooked by the Ethiopian people. I think it's been taken for granted. And, I've dealt with it when I was serving in Ethiopia, and I know the magnitude of the support that the United States gave. So that's one thing. The other thing is behind the scenes, urging all parties to enforce the peace, to accept the peace agreement, to enforce it, to go along with it. And I think the U.S. is trying to do that. It has a reasonable relationship with the government in Addis Ababa. It has, I think, a reasonable relationship with the Tigrayan authorities. It's my understanding that it was a United States military plane that flew at least some of the Tigrayan delegation to Pretoria. And that can be a very useful assistance to a peace process. You have to get the leaders in the same room together. And if you're coming from an area like Mekelle that's difficult to get into and out of, if the United States is in a position to do that, that's a very useful addition of American power. But I think that's the behind-the-scenes effort that will be important. The United States still is a major player in international fora. It has an impact in the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations organizations, and it will play a role there, either positively or negatively, to try to influence the implementation of this agreement. And you may not always see what the U.S. is doing in this regard, but I can assure you they will be involved and they will be engaged. I don't see very many other countries doing that, or even in a position to do it. The European Union can to some extent, but you have to ask yourself, what are countries like Russia and China doing in this dispute? I don't see very much.
Yeah. And trust is a key thing here. And it seems trust is a very rare commodity when it comes to the relations between the federal government and the Tigrayan authorities. at this time. So, how do you envisage that the two will narrow down their differences and keep their promises?
Well, you're absolutely right. Trust is absolutely critical. If you don't have trust, you don't have an agreement. It's just that simple. And you build trust. Trust was, I think, totally gone between the Tigrayans and the central government until this agreement was signed in Pretoria. And it's necessary to rebuild that trust. The trust was lacking, seriously lacking, even before November 2020, when the conflict broke out. It had largely broken down between the two parties, but it totally disappeared after November of 2020. So both sides are starting over again in terms of building trust. The good news is that both sides know each other. The Tigrayans know the central government figures, and the key players in the central government know most of the Tigrayan officials. So that's a good start. If you know each other, it's a little easier to rebuild trust. But it's a process that's going to take time. And if either side starts to break the trust, then everything will fall apart again.
Yeah. So, Ambassador, any final thoughts? As I have exhausted my questions,
Well,
you
my
go ahead.
my only my only final thought would be no one knows how this is ultimately going to play out. I certainly don't know. But it's, as we say in the United States, it's the best game in town right now. In fact, it's the only game in town. And I think it's imperative that everyone who is involved in the peace process take it seriously and try to make the best of it and make it work. I do worry about the Eritrean part of it because I just don't know what their game plan is. I don't know what they're trying, at this point, I don't know what they're trying to accomplish. I think initially their goal was to totally defeat the Tigrayan forces. Maybe that's still their goal. I don't know. Uh, but that is the one big concern that I have in terms of implementing this agreement. But the other players in this, including the Amhara militia, they need to take this seriously and work to resolve the outstanding problems. And this includes what happens ultimately to Western Tigray. I realize it's a disputed territory, and it's going to take years to sort that out. There are claims from the Tigrayan side and the Amhara side. Some of them are historical. That is not going to be solved anytime soon, but it can be solved later on. But it's going to take goodwill and trust on all sides in order to do that.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for this very important reflections. Dear viewers, thank you for watching, and we have come to the end of this interview.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Ambassador.